Chopin's Mazurkas are an example of a perfect fusion between Polish folklore and classical music. But in their beauty lies the biggest mystery and biggest difficulty. What should you know about Chopin's Mazurkas before you play them? I will try to answer that question. For today's episode, we will look closely into Mazurka Opus 33, number 2, and try to get closer to the energy of the Polish dance called oberek.
Hello, nice to see you again. My name is Jerzy Owczarz, and today we will be talking about Chopin's Mazurka Opus 33, number 2 in D major. First, let's take a look at the introduction. This introduction is not as long as in the previous Mazurka, because this introduction consists of only one note, which is connected to the main melody with a bow. It was very common in Polish folklore that the melody was started by this kind of introduction, by this long one note before the entry of the main melody. As you could see in the descriptions of 19th century folkloristic music made by Jacek Kolberg, many of those notes were prolonged by fermata. I would like to show you how this kind of introduction was performed by folkloristic musicians, so please listen carefully to the next example I'm about to present to you. Truth to be told, in this particular mazurka, this first note is not with fermata, and also the overall tempo of the mazurka is quite fast. So if you prolong this first note, it shouldn't be too much, but still you should respect this tradition. Also, well, we have no fermata, but at the same time we have an accent which automatically prolongs the note a little bit. So, if you play this part like this, for me the piece starts too suddenly. But if you make this little fermata, the piece is more prepared and it's much more in style. This fragment of the mazurka is based on oberek. The arguments behind it are, it is in the fast tempo, and oberek was the fastest of three mazur dances. And Jacek Kolberg in 19th century wrote that folkloristic oberek was danced in tempo from 160 to 180 beats per minute. Also, oberek is in light character, and also the melody consists of short motifs which are variated, but also the variations are not so sophisticated as it has place in Kujaw. To understand the flow of oberek better, you have to know how to dance it. So now Łukasz Ożga, ballet dancer from Wrocław Opera House and dancing instructor from Wrocław Academy of Theatrical Arts, will present a basic step for oberek. This basic step is based on the 19th century handbook written by Mestenhauser. Also, this is the only 19th century exact description of how to dance basic steps of oberek.
First, in slow tempo. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And now in regular tempo. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And now with music.
Oberek is very vivid in character. Also, it's quite jumpy. You could see those little jumps in the basic step. We know from 19th century descriptions that part of choreography of oberek was also hołubiec, which is a much bigger jump than the ones presented before. But at the same time, unfortunately, there is no exact description of how hołubiec was performed in oberek in 19th century. We have only descriptions of how hołubiec was performed in Mazur, but I will talk about Mazur in the third episode. So as you could see while watching Łukasz Orzga dancing, the second beat was a little bit prolonged and risen up. So the pulse wasn't a standard one as it has place in waltz, so it wasn't 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was once again next phase of Mazurka pulse, which I mentioned in the previous episode, but this time the second beat is risen up even more than it has been risen up in kujawek. So the pulse in oberek is more like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This version of the Mazurka pulse with the second beat risen up is also very hearable in the way of how folkloristic musicians are performing. So I would like to present you a next recording in which you can hear it really well. So please pay special attention while listening to the example of the part of the accompaniment. In the accompaniment you have maryna, which I described in the previous episode, and you have second violin. So as you could hear in the recording, the second beat was risen up and there was a huge accent on the third beat. This accent on the third beat is also quite characteristic for the Polish folklore, but this is a different kind of accent than the one for the second beat. To visualize better this way of playing, I will show you next recording, this time the audio video. Please pay special attention on the moves which are made by maryna player. As you could see in the recording, the second beat was always played up and with a little jump. So when we create our interpretation of Chopin's Mazurka, we should, in some places, try to imitate this movement. This kind of accompaniment is not exactly suggested by Chopin in this particular Mazurka. You can see more obvious suggestion of this accompaniment in Mazurkas Opus 7, number 3 and 5. But even though this kind of accompaniment is not directly suggested by Chopin in this particular Mazurka, you can still imply it into your interpretation because it is very stylish. And there's a lot of place to imply this kind of accompaniment because oberek has a lot of repetitions. It was a folkloristic tradition to make small changes every time you repeat the phrase. So this way, sometimes I can use this kind of accompaniment I described before, and sometimes I can use a little bit more standard one. My version is to play this jumpy accompaniment in the parts which are forte, especially because Chopin marked an accent for the third beat, which suggests that those parts should be more folkloristic and a little bit less elegant. And the phrases in piano, I would play with smoother accompaniment and much more pedalization, especially because there is no accent on the third beat, so it suggests it should be a little bit more elegant and lighter. As you probably noticed, I'm changing tempo a little bit. This kind of tempo changes are also a part of folkloristic tradition. I covered some of those traditions in the previous episode, but there are many more of them, and it would take a separate film to cover all of them. So for now, it is enough if you remember that in some parts of Chopin's Mazurkas you are allowed to accelerate because it is part of folkloristic tradition, and this fragment is one of those moments. Also, there was a similar moment in the Mazurka from previous episode. So, anyway, let's continue. The next fragment is most probably based on Mazur. I assume that because the melody is quite simple and its rhythm is not as sophisticated as in Kujawiak. Also, character of the fragment is kind of heroic. I will describe Mazur in more details in the next episode. For now, I would like to focus on responsorial form, which you can see in this fragment, and hopefully you also remember one of the examples of this responsorial form from the previous episode. So, the first 4 bars are the part of the solist, next 4 bars are part of the band, and again 4 bars of solist and 4 bars of the band. Now I will show you how this responsorial form looks like in folklore. I will present you 2 recordings. Each of those recordings are representations of different approach to this responsorial form, and both are equally popular. In the first recording, part of solist is more improvisational, and part of the band is more rhythmically disciplined.
A bobka utonęli do góry kuciopą.
To się udało. Udało się.
On the other hand, you have an example in which this responsorial form looks exactly opposite. So the solist part is performed more in tempo, and the band part starts with a big rubato.
A utonął popielarek, utonął, tylko jego kapelusik wypłynął. A tańcował popielarek po drodze, miał trzewicki z mysi prycki na nodze.
A co ja ci moja mamo kupiła, żebyś ty mnie po jarmarkach wodziła? Nie sprzedaj mnie moja mamo nikomu, bo przyjadą kupcykowie do domu.
So, once again, as in previous episode, the difference between solist's part and band part should be shown. but it's up to individual taste of the performer how exactly this difference is shown. So the first version would be improvisational solist. The second version would be with rubato in the band. So both of those versions are logical and in style. So it's up to individual taste of the performer which one of those versions will be chosen. So let's proceed to the next fragment. The next fragment is built on a small motif which is frequently repeated. Also it is in the fast tempo, so I presume this is based on oberek. So, as it is based on the oberek, it should be light in the character. Also, you have this big accent marked on the third beat of the bar. And I would be really tempted to use this tradition of performing oberek and to accelerate the whole fragment as it goes. How you use the phenomena I described and I implied in my interpretation is all up to you as a performer. But if you decide to ignore all of them, very boring and kind of painful to listen to. The next fragment is a repetition of the beginning of the mazurka, so there is no need for me to analyze it once more. So let's skip to coda. In coda, you don't have any new phenomena than the ones I described before, and also it's quite well described by Chopin, so you know well what should you accelerate and when you should come down. So, as the interpretation of this part is quite obvious, I don't think you need my help in deciphering it. So, thank you for listening, and please remember that if you are working on your interpretation of Chopin's mazurka, it is really important that you go deep into the Chopin's texts. You analyze every little dot, every little bow. It is also important to know this folkloristic context, because folklore is a base which Chopin used to create his mazurkas. And the last thing, which is I think the most important and divides major pianists from those who are just beginning, is finding a good balance between folklore, Chopinistic elegance, and your own individual taste. So, stay tuned and see you in the next episode.